My sister mocked me for being single at 34, and everyone laughed. I said nothing. Then my husband, a renowned surgeon, walked in with my 5-year-old twins and shocked everyone. The linen napkin felt crisp between my fingers as I folded it into smaller and smaller squares, a nervous habit I developed somewhere around my 16th birthday, when my mother first started commenting on my weight at family dinners. 34 years of practice had made me an expert at appearing calm, while my insides turned with familiar dread. Mom's 72nd birthday lunch was being held at Castellanos, the kind of upscale Italian restaurant where bread baskets cost extra and the waiters looked personally offended if you asked for tap water. The private dining room my father had reserved could comfortably seat 20, but our party of 7 felt swallowed by the space. Green-colored walls absorbed the tension that radiated from every corner of our family gathering. More wine. Anyone. Dad lifted this bottle of Chianti, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he squinted at the label like he hadn't personally selected it from the reserve list. My mother, Claudia, sat at the head of the table in a dove-gray cashmere wrap that probably cost more than my first car. Her silver hair was styled in the same elegant bob she'd worn for 2 decades, and her makeup was flawless as always. 72 looked good on her, I had to admit. Years of spa treatments and careful dieting had preserved her in a kind of wealthy amber. To her right sat my sister Miranda, 3 years my junior, and the undisputed golden child of the family. Miranda had inherited Mom's delicate bone structure and Dad's dark eyes, a combination that had served her well in the pageant circuit during her teens and the marriage market in her 20s. Her husband Quentin occupied the chair beside her, his presence more of an accessory than a participant. He'd learned early in their marriage that the women in our family did most of the talking. Aunt Sylvia, Mom's younger sister, rounded out our party. She'd flown in from Arizona specifically for this lunch, and her desert tan skin stood out against the pale complexions of my immediate family. Grandma Edith had passed 3 years ago, so Sylvia was the last remaining link to my mother's side of the family. "Judith, dear, you look tired." Mom's observation landed like a precisely aimed dart. "Are you not sleeping well?" "I'm fine, Mom. Work has been busy." "Ah, yes, your little job." The dismissal was subtle but unmistakable. My career as a medical researcher at one of the country's top universities was perpetually reduced to a little job in family conversations. Miranda's role as a stay-at-home mother to her 7-year-old son, Adrienne, meanwhile, was discussed with reverent admiration. Speaking of which, Miranda chimed in, setting down her wine glass with performative delicacy. "I ran into your old college roommate last week, Naomi Tanaka. She's pregnant with her 3rd. Good for her." I kept my voice neutral, sensing the trap, but unable to see its precise shape yet. "She asked about you. Actually wanted to know if you were still single." And there it was, the familiar territory we covered at every family gathering for the past decade. I was 34, unmarried, childless, and therefore by my family's metrics a profound disappointment. "I told her you were focusing on your career." Miranda continued, her tone dripping with false sympathy. She understood. "Of course not everyone is cut out for family life." Dad cleared his throat, a sound that usually preceded some variation of the same lecture I'd been hearing since my late 20s. Raymond had built his accounting firm from nothing, working 70-hour weeks until he could afford to slow down. His definition of success had always been narrowly focused: financial stability, social standing, and grandchildren. I provided none of these things in any satisfactory measure. "Your sister has a point, Judith." He swirled his wine, not meeting my eyes. "At 34, and still single, it's concerning. Your mother and I worry about you." "We do," Mom agreed, dabbing at her lips with her napkin. "You'll die alone with no family at this rate. What happens when you're our age? Who will take care of you?" The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and suffocating. Around the table, heads nodded in sad agreement. Aunt Sylvia, Dad. Even Quentin, who rarely voiced opinions, managed a sympathetic grimace. "Such a waste," Dad added, shaking his head. "All that education, all those opportunities, and for what? An empty apartment and a job that won't keep you warm at night." I should have been devastated. 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, this conversation would have sent me spiraling into weeks of self-doubt and tearful phone calls to my therapist. But today, I just smiled and checked my watch. 3 minutes. "You know," Miranda added, "settle down at 26. Mom continued, apparently mistaking my silence for submission. "And look at her now. A beautiful home, a wonderful husband, an adorable son. That could have been you, Judith. That should have been you." "I remember when you were little," Aunt Sylvia added, her voice carrying that particular brand of concern that was really judgment wrapped in velvet. "You used to play with baby dolls constantly. What happened to that girl? I took a slow sip of my water, letting the ice clink against the glass. The restaurant's ambient music shifted to something classical strings, swelling in a crescendo that felt almost theatrical. She grew up, I said simply. Miranda scoffed. Grew up into what exactly? A woman who spends her weekends in a laboratory instead of building a life. Face it, Judith. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them alone. 2 minutes. I've tried to set you up so many times, Mom lamented. Do you remember the Henderson boy, the one whose father owns the car dealerships? He asked about you constantly, and you refused to even meet him for coffee. He was divorced twice by 30, I pointed out mildly. At least he was trying. Dad's voice rose slightly, drawing a curious glance from a passing waiter. At least he understood that life is about more than work and independence and whatever else you tell yourself to justify this spinster existence. The word landed with all the impact he'd intended. Spinster, like I was a character in a Victorian novel destined to wither away in some drafty corner of a family estate. 1 minute. I just don't understand where we went wrong, Mom said. And this time her voice carried genuine bewilderment. We gave you everything. Private schools, dance lessons, summer camps. Miranda turned out perfectly normal, so it can't be our parenting. What is it about you that's so broken? Miranda supplied helpfully. I was going to say different, but yes, something is clearly broken. 30 seconds. I sat down my water glass and smoothed the napkin across my lap. My heart was beating faster now, but not from hurt. Anticipation thrummed through my veins like electricity. You know what I find interesting? I said, my voice calm and measured. In all these years of criticism, not one of you has ever actually asked about my life. You've assumed, you've judged, you've projected your own fears and disappointments onto me, but you've never once thought to simply ask. Miranda rolled her eyes. What's there to ask? We see the evidence in front of us. No ring, no children, no. The restaurant's main doors opened, visible through the glass partition that separated our private room from the main dining area. A man walked in, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked dark hair, and the kind of confident posture that drew attention without demanding it. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, and his hand rested on the shoulders of 2 children, a boy and a girl, both around 5 years old with matching dark curls and bright, curious eyes. Behind them, a young woman in professional attire carried an infant in a designer car seat, the baby's face peaceful in sleep. Excuse me for a moment. I pushed back my chair and walked toward the entrance, leaving my family's confused silence behind me. Dr. Garrett Morrison, head of cardiothoracic surgery at Metropolitan General Hospital, published researcher, and according to last year's medical journal rankings, one of the top 50 cardiac surgeons in the country, met me halfway across the restaurant with a smile that still made my knees weak after 7 years together. Sorry we're late, sweetheart. He kissed my cheek, his hand finding its natural place at the small of my back. Parking was a nightmare. You're right on time, actually. I knelt down to hug our twins, Lily and Oliver, who immediately began chattering about the exciting car ride and the promise of birthday cake for great-grandma. Our nanny Teresa shifted the car seat slightly. Charlotte woke up about 10 minutes ago but fell right back asleep. Want me to keep her out here until you're ready? No. Bring her in. I want Mom to meet her newest grandchild. The walk back to the private dining room felt like a victory march. Garrett's hand remained steady on my back, a warm and grounding presence. The twins skipped ahead, their patent leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. When we entered the room, the silence was absolute. My mother's wine glass had frozen halfway to her lips. Dad's mouth hung open in an expression I'd never seen from him before. Miranda looked like she'd been slapped, and Aunt Sylvia clutched her chest as if witnessing a miracle. Everyone I said I'd like you to meet. My husband, Dr. Garrett Morrison, and our children, Lily and Oliver, who just turned 5 last month, and Charlotte, who's 6 months old. Garrett stepped forward with the easy confidence of a man who'd faced far more intimidating audiences than my stunned family. It's wonderful to finally meet you all. Judith has told me so much about you. The implication hung in the air. Yes, he knew exactly what they thought of me. And yes, he was here anyway. I don't understand. Mom's voice came out strangled. How did we met at a medical conference 7 years ago? I explained, taking my seat and gesturing for Teresa to bring Charlotte closer. Got married 5 years ago in a small ceremony. Had the twins through IVF after some fertility challenges. And Charlotte was a wonderful surprise. The weight of those words seemed to physically press my family back into their chairs. 8 years. I had been living an entirely separate existence for nearly a decade. and they had been so consumed with their assumptions that they'd never noticed the happiness radiating from me at every gathering they'd bothered to invite me to. Garrett pulled out a chair for Oliver, helping him settle in with the practiced ease of a father who'd done this thousands of times. Our son immediately began examining the silverware with scientific curiosity, holding the fork up to the light and squinting at his reflection in the polished surface. "Daddy, I look funny in this," Oliver announced, completely unbothered by the tension crackling through the room. "That's because it's curved, buddy. Concave surfaces distort reflections." Garrett ruffled his hair affectionately. Lily, meanwhile, had taken it upon herself to introduce herself properly. She marched around the table with the confidence of someone who'd never been told she wasn't enough, stopping in front of each family member with her hand extended. "I'm Lily Morrison. I'm 5 3/4. I can read chapter books and I'm learning piano." She shook my mother's limp hand with vigor. "You're my grandmother. Mommy showed me pictures." Mom looked like she might faint. Her carefully applied foundation couldn't hide the blood draining from her face as this small, fierce version of me stood before her demanding acknowledgement. Yes, I suppose I am." Mom's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Grandma Elaine gives us cookies when we visit." Lily continued, referencing Garrett's mother with casual ease. "Do you bake cookies?" "I have a housekeeper who—" "That's okay. Not everyone bakes." Lily patted Mom's hand with magnanimous understanding before moving on to Dad. "You're my grandfather. Do you like puzzles?" "I love puzzles. The hard ones with tiny pieces." Dad stared at this miniature inquisitor with something approaching awe. "I used to do puzzles when I was younger. You should start again. It's good for your brain." Lily nodded sagely, dispensing wisdom like a tiny life coach before completing her rounds with Aunt Sylvia and the still frozen forms of Miranda and Quentin. I watched my daughter work the room and felt the surge of pride so intense it nearly brought tears to my eyes. She had never learned to shrink herself. She had never been taught that her opinions were too loud or her presence too much. Garrett and I had made sure of that. 6 years, Dad finally found his voice, and it was sharp with accusation. "You've been married for 6 years and you never told us." 5 years, I corrected, "and you never asked." I lifted Charlotte from her car seat, cradling her against my chest. She stirred slightly, her tiny fist curling around my finger. "You assumed I was alone, so I let you keep assuming." Miranda finally managed to close her mouth. "But why? Why would you hide this?" "Because every conversation with this family has been an interrogation about my failures, my weight, my career choices, my relationship status." I kept my voice steady. Years of therapy finally paying off. I got tired of defending myself against people who already decided I wasn't good enough, so I stopped trying to change their minds and focused on living my life. Garrett settled into the chair beside me, pulling Oliver onto his lap, while Lily claimed the seat on my other side. Teresa quietly excused herself to wait in the lobby. "Judith." Mom's voice had taken on a wounded quality. "We're your family. We had a right to know." "Did you? You had a right to know about the 3 years of fertility treatments, the miscarriage, before the twins, the postpartum depression I struggled with after they were born." I shook my head slowly. "Every time I considered telling you, I imagined the comments, the criticism, the way you'd find some way to make my joy into your disappointment." "That's not fair," Aunt Sylvia protested weakly. "Isn't it? 30 minutes ago, you were all nodding along while Mom called me broken. You didn't defend me. You didn't even look uncomfortable." I met each of their eyes in turn. "This is why I kept my family separate from you, because Garrett and these children deserve better than to be picked apart by people who see flaws in everything." Garrett squeezed my hand under the table. "For what it's worth, I encouraged Judith to keep trying with you all. She wanted to believe things could be different. But when we were planning our wedding and she called to test the waters, the conversation was about how she'd gained weight and was probably depressed. I remembered that call vividly. I mentioned I had exciting news, and before I could share it, Mom had launched into a detailed critique of my appearance at Easter brunch the previous month. So we eloped. I continued, had a beautiful ceremony in Hawaii with friends who actually celebrated us, and we built a life that's better than anything I could have imagined without your approval or involvement. The silence stretched. Oliver whispered something to his father about wanting bread, and Garrett flagged down a waiter to request a basket. The mundane interruption somehow made everything more real, more present. "I'm a grandmother," Mom said finally, her voice strange and distant. "I've been a grandmother for 5 years, and I didn't know." "You've been a grandmother for 5 years while actively telling your daughter she'd die alone and unloved." I let the correction land. "Those were choices yours." Dad cleared his throat multiple times before speaking. The surgeon thing, that's real. You're actually married to a doctor, a renowned one, apparently. Garrett's smile carried just a hint of edge, though I prefer to think of myself as Judith's husband first. The MD is secondary. He's being modest. I couldn't help the warmth that crept into my voice. He's done groundbreaking work on minimally invasive cardiac procedures, published extensively, gets flown around the world for consultations. Meanwhile, your daughter's little job has produced research that's contributed to 3 major pharmaceutical developments, Garrett added. She saved more lives than I have. Honestly, I just get the dramatic operating room stories. Miranda seemed to be having trouble processing any of this. Her husband, Quentin, had gone pale, perhaps realizing that the comfortable narrative of his sister-in-law's failure had been built on sand. "Why are you here now?" Miranda finally asked. "If you've been so happy without us, why show up today?" It was a fair question, and I'd wrestled with the answer for weeks. Because Mom is turning 72, because Dad's health isn't what it used to be, and because my children deserve the chance to know their extended family, even if that family has work to do. Charlotte chose that moment to wake fully, her blue eyes blinking up at me with the unfocused wonder of infancy. She made a small sound, something between a coo and a hiccup, and I automatically began swaying slightly to soothe her. "She has your eyes," Aunt Sylvia observed quietly. "All 3 of them do, actually." "They have Judith's stubbornness, too," Garrett said with obvious affection. Oliver refused to sleep anywhere but his mother's arms for the first 4 months. Lily taught herself to read at 3 because she wanted to prove she could. Charlotte already has opinions about everything. "Sounds familiar," Dad muttered, but his tone had shifted. The accusation had faded into something more complicated. Mom rose from her seat, slowly approaching our end of the table with uncertain steps. She stopped in front of me, her eyes fixed on Charlotte. May I hold her?" The question carried weight far beyond its simple words. This was my mother asking permission to enter my world, a world she dismissed and denigrated for decades. I hesitated. Garrett's hand found mine again, steady and supportive, whatever I decided he would back me completely. "Her name is Charlotte," I said, finally carefully transferring the baby into my mother's arms. Charlotte Rose Morrison. Rose was Garrett's grandmother's name. Mom's face transformed as she held her youngest grandchild. The carefully maintained mask of judgment and disappointment cracked, and beneath it I glimpsed something I hadn't seen since early childhood. Genuine emotion, unfiltered and raw. "She's beautiful," Mom whispered. "They're all beautiful." Lily tugged at my mother's sleeve, her face scrunched with the serious expression she wore when working through complex problems. "Grandma, are you the grandma who was mean to Mommy?" The table went rigid. I closed my eyes briefly, wondering how much the twins had overheard and understood over the years. I suppose I was." Mom's voice broke slightly. "I'm sorry about that, sweetheart. Mommy says, sorry isn't enough if you keep doing the bad thing." Lily nodded sagely, delivering this piece of wisdom with the absolute confidence of a 5-year-old. "You have to actually stop. She's right." I met my mother's gaze over Charlotte's sleeping form. Sorry is a start, but I've heard sorry before, followed by months of the same behavior. My children won't grow up with that. "What do you want from us?" Dad asked, and for once his voice held genuine curiosity rather than challenge. "I want you to get to know my family, the real us, not your assumptions about us." I took a breath, steadying myself. "I want you to ask questions and actually listen to the answers. I want Liliana, Oliver, and Charlotte to have grandparents who love them without conditions. And I want my sister to stop treating my existence as her personal measuring stick for success." Miranda flinched but didn't argue. "We can try," Mom said slowly, still cradling Charlotte. "I can't promise we'll be perfect. Old habits can change if you actually want them to change." I softened slightly. "I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for effort. Real effort, not just lip service." Garrett signaled the waiter for menus, smoothly transitioning the moment before it could collapse under its own emotional weight. "The twins are starving, and I believe there's a birthday cake waiting for the guest of honor. What do you say we start fresh, have lunch, get to know each other? Can we get spaghetti?" Oliver asked hopefully. "You always want spaghetti." Lily rolled her eyes with a dramatic flair only a 5-year-old could muster. "You're boring." "I'm not. Our 2 children?" Garrett said mildly, and both twins settled immediately, though they continued to make faces at each other. Mom returned Charlotte to my arms before taking her seat, and I noticed her hands were trembling slightly. Whether from emotion or age, or both, I couldn't tell. How did you two meet? Sylvia asked, making an obvious effort to follow my instructions about asking questions. You mentioned a conference, Seattle. Garrett said, a smile playing at his lips. International Medical Research Symposium. I was presenting on cardiac regeneration therapy, and Judith was there with her team discussing their work on autoimmune responses. We ended up at the same hotel bar after a particularly brutal Q&A session. He was complaining about a reviewer who clearly hadn't read his actual paper. I added loudly. He corrected to himself. I was not talking to myself. I was practicing my rebuttal. To the bourbon. The bourbon was very supportive. He grinned at me. And 7 years of knowing each other flickered between us in that single expression. Your daughter, on the other hand, proceeded to explain exactly why the reviewer was right about my methodology and then stayed up until 3 in the morning helping me redesign the study. You were stubborn about the control groups, I reminded him. I was passionate about the control groups. There's a difference. Miranda watched this exchange with an expression I couldn't quite read. Her marriage to Quentin had been a society affair. Suitable families combined assets, carefully curated compatibility. Whatever existed between them, it didn't look like what Garrett and I had. I caught her studying Garrett's hand on mine, the unconscious way he leaned toward me when he spoke, the private glances we exchanged without thinking. These were the accumulated habits of a partnership built on genuine connection rather than strategic alliance. Quentin, by contrast, sat rigidly beside her, his attention fixed on his phone beneath the table. He'd barely looked at his wife since the revelation, too absorbed in whatever distraction his screen provided. Miranda noticed me noticing, and something flickered across her face. Embarrassment, perhaps, or the painful recognition of contrast. The salmon here is excellent, Garrett offered to break the lengthening silence, gesturing toward the menu. Judith and I came for our anniversary last year. The chef does something remarkable with the citrus glaze. You celebrate anniversaries here? Dad asked, still struggling to reconcile his mental image of my solitary existence with the reality sitting before him. 5 so far, Garrett said, smiling at me with warmth that required no performance. Though our second anniversary was spent in the NICU, the twins decided to arrive 7 weeks early, so our romantic dinner became vending machine coffee and shift rotations at their incubators. They were so small, I added the memory still capable of tightening my chest. Oliver was just under 4 pounds. Lily was slightly bigger, but had more breathing issues initially. We lived at that hospital for 3 weeks. The medical details seemed to ground the conversation in reality for my family. These weren't abstract children who'd materialized to prove a point. They were babies who'd fought for their lives, parents who'd weathered terrifying uncertainty, a family forged in the fires of genuine struggle. I had no idea. Mom repeated her phrase, becoming a refrain of regret. All those months, and we never... You called me twice during that period. I said, not accusingly, simply stating fact. Once to remind me about Cousin Patrick's wedding gift, and once to critique my absence at Easter brunch. Neither conversation invited personal disclosure. And the twins' mom asked, you mentioned fertility treatments. The question could have been an ambush. Years of family dinners had conditioned me to expect criticism hiding in every query. But something had shifted in the room, and I chose to answer honestly. We tried for a year before pursuing IVF. The first round didn't take. The second resulted in a pregnancy we lost at 11 weeks. I kept my voice steady, though. Garrett's hand tightened on mine. The third round gave us these two. It was exhausting and heartbreaking and expensive. And it was worth every moment. I had no idea. Mom's voice was soft. If we'd known, you'd have known if you'd asked, or if our conversations hadn't always circled back to my perceived failures. I wasn't trying to be cruel, but I wasn't going to pretend either. I needed support during those years. I got it from Garrett, from my friends, from my therapist, not from my family. Dad shifted uncomfortably. We thought we assumed you weren't interested in children. That career was your priority. Career has always been a priority. It wasn't my only priority. I shook my head. But you decided what I was, and nothing I said could change that. So I stopped trying. The food arrived then, and conversation lulled as plates were distributed and children were settled with appropriate portions. Oliver got his spaghetti. Lily chose salmon, which she declared very sophisticated. Charlotte slept through it, all content in her car seat beside my chair. As the meal progressed, something unexpected happened. Questions came, real questions with listening attached to them. Mom asked about my research, and for the first time she actually let me explain it without interruption or dismissal. Dad inquired about Garrett's work and seemed genuinely impressed by the answers. Aunt Sylvia discovered that Lily shared her passion for puzzles and spent 20 minutes discussing their favorites. Miranda remained quieter than usual, picking at her food while Quentin made awkward small talk with Garrett about sports. When she finally spoke, her question surprised me. "Are you happy, Judith?" "Actually happy." There was something raw beneath the words, something that made me look at my sister more closely. The perfect hair and designer dress and careful makeup suddenly seemed less like confidence and more like armor. "Yes," I said simply. "I really am." She nodded slowly, her eyes distant. "Good. That's good." Later I would wonder about that exchange, wonder what lay beneath Miranda's perfect surface. But that afternoon, it was enough to acknowledge that my little sister might be more complex than I'd given her credit for. The birthday cake arrived, an elaborate chocolate creation that made the twins' eyes go wide with desire. We sang badly and enthusiastically. Mom blew out her candles with Charlotte on her lap, and something in her expression suggested she was reconsidering every wish she'd ever made. "I want to be better," she said to me quietly as the cake was being sliced. "I don't know if I can be, but I want to try. That's a start." The things we said earlier, she swallowed hard. The things we've been saying for years. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "I know." And I did. I could see the regret written across her face, genuine and painful. "We can't undo the past, Mom. We can only decide what happens next. What do you want to happen next?" I watched Lily carefully transferring a piece of cake to her brother's plate, explaining that he'd gotten a smaller piece and that wasn't fair. Oliver accepted this redistribution with suspiciously rapid grace, having clearly planned for exactly this outcome. Garrett caught my eye and smiled, sharing the amusement of parenting two tiny schemers. "I want Sunday dinners," I said finally. "I want you to call and ask about my day without it becoming a critique. I want Lily and Oliver to have sleepovers at your house and come home with stories about Grandma's cookies and Grandpa's bad jokes. I want Charlotte to know she has a family beyond me and Garrett." "We can do that." Mom reached for my hand and her grip was stronger than I expected. "We can absolutely do that. It won't be easy. There will be moments when old patterns creep back in. When criticism sneaks into conversation, when you look at my choices and see failures instead of differences. Then you'll tell us, Mom said firmly, and we'll try harder." It wasn't a fairy tale resolution. There would be setbacks and frustrations and moments when I wondered if I'd made a mistake opening this door. But sitting in that restaurant with my husband and children and my deeply flawed family, I felt something I hadn't expected. Hope. Garrett drove us home that evening, the twins asleep in their car seats and Charlotte making the soft sounds of impending hunger. The city lights flickered past the windows and I rested my head against the seat, emotionally exhausted. "You okay?" he asked, reaching over to squeeze my knee. "I think so. Ask me again in 6 months." "Your mom asked if she could come to Oliver's soccer game next weekend." "What did you say?" "I said she'd have to ask you, but that I thought you'd probably say yes." I smiled, watching the streetlights paint patterns across the ceiling. "You know me pretty well. I've had 7 years of practice." He pulled into our driveway, the motion sensor lights illuminating the front of our house. "For what it's worth, I'm proud of you. That took guts. It took desperation. Honestly, I couldn't sit through another family gathering pretending to be the spinster aunt they decided I was." That word. He shook his head. "When your dad said that, I nearly interrupted the whole plan." "I know. I saw your hand clench. How can they see you, you specifically, the most incredible woman I've ever met, and call you broken, call you a waste?" His voice carried genuine bewilderment because they weren't seeing me. They were seeing the story they'd constructed about me, the cautionary tale. I unbuckled my seatbelt and turned to face him. Today, I forced them to see reality instead. Whether they like what they see is up to them. We carried the children inside together, the practiced choreography of parents who'd done this hundreds of times. Bath time and pajamas and bedtime stories, Charlotte's feeding and settling, the quiet closing of bedroom doors. Later, in the stillness of our bedroom, Garrett pulled me close. "Lily's comment about Grandma being mean to you," he said into my hair. "That was something. Kids absorb more than we think. She's protective of me. They both are." I paused. "They're also very excited about potentially having grandparents who aren't just names in our stories." "I know." I traced patterns on his chest, thinking, I don't want to set them up for disappointment. "If your family can't actually change, then we deal with that if it happens. But you gave them a chance today. That's all anyone can do." He was right. Of course he was. The months that followed were complicated. Not the dramatic transformation of movie montages, but the messy, incremental progress of real human beings trying to break lifelong patterns. Mom came to Oliver's soccer game and cheered too loudly at the wrong moments and embarrassed everyone. But she came and she asked questions about his team and his friends and his favorite position instead of criticizing my parenting choices. Dad took Lily to a puzzle store and spent 3 hours helping her select the perfect 1,000-piece challenge. He later admitted to Garrett that he hadn't realized how smart she was, which somehow felt like an apology for all the times he'd underestimated me. Miranda and I had coffee one afternoon while the kids were with their respective sitters. She confessed that her marriage was struggling, that Quentin's emotional absence had grown into something she couldn't ignore anymore. I listened without judgment, and when she cried, I handed her tissues and didn't try to fix anything. "I thought you had it wrong, you know," she said, mascara streaking her cheeks, waiting so long, focusing on career. "I thought you'd end up alone and sad, and that I'd made the better choice. And now, I think there's no perfect choice, just different ones." She wiped her eyes. "You seem happy. Actually happy. I wanted to resent you for it, but I can't anymore. I just want to figure out what that looks like for me." "It looks different for everyone," I said. "But you can't find it if you're living someone else's expectations." It was the kind of wisdom I'd earned through years of therapy and self-reflection, and offering it to my sister felt like closing a circle I hadn't known was open. Aunt Sylvia visited again at Christmas, and this time she brought genuine interest instead of judgment. She wanted to hear about my work, understand my research, know my children as individuals rather than accessories. "Your grandmother would be proud of you," she told me privately, her eyes misty. "She always thought you were special, different from the rest of us in the best way. I wish she could have met Garrett and the kids. She knew you'd find your path. She told me so the last time we spoke before she passed." Sylvia squeezed my hand. She said, "You were too stubborn to settle for anything less than what you deserved." My mother overheard this exchange and had the grace to look ashamed, but shame wasn't what I wanted from her. Growth was, and slowly, imperfectly, she was giving me that. There were setbacks. A comment at Easter about how Lily needed to be more ladylike, a suggestion at Father's Day that Oliver should focus more on sports and less on the art he loved. Each time I pushed back calmly and firmly, and each time the offending family member apologized and adjusted. "Boundaries," my therapist said when I reported these incidents. "You're finally enforcing them." How does that feel? Exhausting but necessary. Growth usually is both of those things. By the time Charlotte's first birthday arrived, something had shifted fundamentally in our family dynamic. Not a fairy tale transformation. And my mother still had opinions about my housekeeping. And my father still occasionally forgot that my career was actually important, but they were trying, making efforts, showing up, and doing the work of relationship repair. The birthday party was held at our house, a chaos of streamers and cake and screaming children. My family mingled with Garrett's parents who had flown in from Portland. Our friends from work and the neighborhood filled the backyard with conversation and laughter. Mom found me in the kitchen refilling the lemonade pitcher. She'd been better lately, more careful with her words, more curious about our lives. But I still tensed slightly when we were alone together. "I've been thinking," she said, leaning against the counter. "About that day at Castellanos, about all the things I said before you brought them in. Mom, we don't have to. Yes, we do." She met my eyes, and for once there was no judgment there. "I called you broken. I called you a waste. I said you'd die alone. Those words, they haunt me. I survived them. You shouldn't have had to." Her voice cracked. "That's what I'm trying to say. You shouldn't have had to build this beautiful life in secret because your own mother couldn't see past her own expectations." I set down the pitcher, giving her my full attention. "I thought I knew what happiness looked like," she continued. "Marriage by 25 children by 30. The right neighborhoods and the right schools and the right social circles. That's what my mother taught me. That's what I tried to teach you." "It worked for Miranda," I pointed out. "Did it really?" She sighed. "Miranda is finally getting the help she needs. Therapy may be a trial separation. She told me last week that she's been unhappy for years but didn't know how to admit it. I thought of my sister's tears at our coffee date, her confession that she'd followed the script perfectly and still ended up lost. I'm glad she's getting help. So am I. But it makes me wonder how much of her unhappiness came from me pushing her toward a life she didn't actually want. Mom's voice cracked slightly, just like I pushed you away by refusing to see who you actually were. "Mom, I have something real here." She gestured toward the window where Garrett was visible in the backyard, Charlotte in his arms, while the twins ran circles around him. Something genuine and earned and beautiful. And I almost missed all of it because I was too busy mourning the daughter I thought you should be instead of celebrating the daughter you actually are. I corrected softly. The daughter I actually am. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. The daughter you actually are, who's brilliant and stubborn and loving and so much stronger than I ever gave her credit for. I hugged her, then really hugged her the way I hadn't since childhood. She felt smaller than I remembered, older, more fragile. But beneath the physical changes, I sensed something I'd never felt from her before. Acceptance. Thank you, I whispered. Thank you for giving us another chance. She pulled back, wiping her eyes. Now let's go watch your daughter destroy her cake. I believe that's a birthday tradition. We returned to the party together, and I watched my children play in a backyard full of people who love them. Grandparents and aunts and uncles and friends. The family I built and the family I'd been born into finally finding ways to coexist. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was, but it was real and it was mine. And sitting there with Garrett's arm around me and Charlotte's frosting-covered hand reaching for my face, I felt the profound peace of a woman who had learned the most important lesson of all. The best revenge against people who had written you off wasn't bitterness or isolation. It was building a life so beautiful, so authentic, so full of joy, that their narrow definitions of success became irrelevant. My sister had said I'd die alone with no family. She'd been wrong. We'd all been wrong about each other, trapped in stories we'd constructed instead of the truth standing right in front of us. But stories could be rewritten. People could grow. And sometimes when the restaurant doors opened at exactly the right moment, everything changed. I smiled at my husband, kissed my children, and decided that whatever came next, I was ready for it. After all, I'd waited 34 years to show them who I really was. Whatever the future held couldn't possibly be harder than this.